Can you go on Facebook and see what's going on that end, Noura?
Yeah, sure.
I believe this is starting to record on our end as well.
Oh
So,
yeah.
right, and it's also trans.
Okay, I'm
Right.
showing you on. Yeah, you're good on Facebook.
Okay, good.
Alhamdulillah.
So let's continue. Is it showing Tafsir al-Qurtubi?
Yes.
And is it showing the Quran right now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we're on the same page, inshallah. So we'll see. Can you hear the Facebook alone and not from here to see that it's actually giving us a good bandwidth?
Yeah, let me check.
So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, we're still on Surah An-Nisa, and we had been doing Surah An-Nisa for quite a while, alhamdulillah. We passed a number of different issues where we talked about, of course, uh, some things related to food. We also talked about al-mithaq al-ghalid. We also talked about the relationship between Muslims and the Yahud and Bani Israel, and certainly the Muslims and the Christians, the Muslims, and of course uh, the pagan, all of those. So, of course, laying out, but there was one specific group that was really standing out amongst all of this was basically the hypocrites. So we did go in some details about those, but there's a lot more to be said in regard to that. And inshallah, we'll be continuing to speak about that particular group and its relationship with the Muslim community, how they had an impact in causing a lot of divisions, or sometimes how they attempted to cause a lot of divisions, and certainly other Muslims that might also be affected by them without them realizing in different ways. We'll talk about that. So we went in within that ayah, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَإِذَا نَدَيْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ اتَّخَذُوهَا هُزُوًا وَلَعِبًا ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَوْمٌ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. When you would call on to the prayer, they would take it as mockery and a place of entertainment. ذلك بأنهم قوم لا يعقلون, for they are people that cannot think. Now here's one thing: when you're talking about cannot think, cannot process, how is it that they can't think? Well, certainly they might actually have a degree from Harvard, or probably even have higher degrees that show that they do actually process. They're capable of thinking. They probably might have high IQ. So the problem is not necessarily in the whole idea of understanding and having an IQ. But here, this لا يعقلون is to actually express that they are not letting their own intelligence relate to the reality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the revelation onto Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right, so to continue within that line, we were talking about al-adhan, the ruling of al-adhan, and certainly when we look at al-Qurtubi, yes, he will take one topic and then sometimes he'll go into, I guess, the all the different because it's a book of ayat ahkam, more focused on ayat al-ahkam, which basically are the ayat that have legislations. So that's why he will basically focus on that. And we did talk about, so here we go. He said there are 12 different topics or let's say different categories relating this ayah right there. So he talked about the ruling. Well, first of all, he talked about why this ayah was revealed. Well, because the Jews were basically mocking and also, of course, making all those ridiculous comments on Muslims because they were making salah. So that ayah was basically describing what was happening and how the Muslims were at the time. Keep in mind that they were a minority. They were a minority in Medina, so they weren't capable of protecting themselves or even, of course, bringing honor to themselves. So that's why you would see that those were very common behaviors that were surrounding them. And that's the same thing. I want you to keep in mind that throughout Muslim history, Muslims were always a minority. So just keep that one in mind. Many would think that this is the first time that we're a minority, or perhaps the Muslims being in particular areas that they're minorities. Definitely, I do recognize that the Muslims are a minority, but you just keep in mind that the Muslims were a minority even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Even when the Muslims had grown in number, the Muslims were still a minority within the Arabian Peninsula, and later on, of course, even when the Muslims were conquering all those countries, they were still a minority. Yes, the governance was Muslim, but the Muslims were still considered a minority. So they were a minority of Muslims within Muslim governance. All right, so that was also a common thing that was happening. In where, just keep that in mind, in where, how and what do we do for our children, for, of course, our own selves? Do we let the mockery take its course on us, or do we actually stand and get that spiritual support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And of course, Al-Qurtubi goes in details, and then he says, وَالنِّدَاءُ الدُّعَاءُ بِرَفْعِ الصَّوْتِ. So what is it? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said right there, وَإِذَا نَادَيْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. What does it mean if they were to call on to prayer? Well, this basically is speaking about al-Adhan. And we went into certain points. We said there was no Adhan before Hijrah. They used to make the Adhan, or at least the call, by saying as-salatu jami'ah. That salah is basically combining everyone. When the Prophet ﷺ had migrated to Medina, that's when, of course, the Qibla changed, and that's when he had ordered to make the Adhan. We went into speaking about some of the story of al-Adhan. We said Abdullah ibn Zayd, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, they had a dream in regards to Adhan, and that they were making the Adhan, and they pretty much had the similar dream, and they basically said it and told it to the Prophet ﷺ. That's when the Prophet ﷺ had chosen Bilal to be the person that demonstrates the dream that they all had as a way to call for salah. The Prophet ﷺ, there is a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had heard al-Adhan on the night of al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, that night he had ascended to al-Isra, or to Bayt al-Maqdis, to al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and then to the heavens. And we talked about, of course, the chain of narration for this hadith right there. And we said what we had seen, and where لا يصح شيء من هذه الأحاديث والحق أنه لا يصح شيء من هذه الأحاديث, in where what was mentioned, and where he said, and the truth, nothing in regards to this topic, or at least in regards to this hadith right there, that the Prophet ﷺ had heard the Adhan during the night of al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. There was nothing authentic in that regards. Of course, we did mention in details about some of the Adhan and what the words are going to be saying. We're going to talk about that in just a bit, inshallah. But then, of course, part of the Adhan is specifically in Salat al-Subh. In Salat al-Subh, in where when everyone, of course, would be asleep, that he would add as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm, that prayer is better than sleep. And the Prophet ﷺ had approved it, and you could see it was not part of what of course, Abdullah ibn Zayd or Umar ibn al-Khattab or Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. It wasn't something that was part of the Adhan that they had seen, but it was something that the Prophet ﷺ or Bilal ibn Rabah, he thought of saying it, so he added it, and the Prophet ﷺ approved it. Now, this one actually, this piece of it, within the Muslim, let's just say Muslim community, okay, let me just mention this piece of it, in where you had some Muslims, specifically, for example, the Sufi, in where they would oftentimes use this as evidence. Here's Bilal ibn Rabah. He had added something onto the Adhan, and the Prophet ﷺ approved it. It wasn't added before. So they'll say, therefore, we don't necessarily have to have a dhikr or any dua that necessarily traces back to authentic references, and we can generate our own, and as long as it doesn't contradict, for example, the general text, then it should be okay, and there's nothing wrong with it. So they'll use they'll use their own dua, or they might actually make their own dhikr, such as saying Yahu, or even jumping and using those different ways of creating meditations, and saying that that's basically something that their shaykh might have somehow had the inspiration, and they'll claim that just as Abdullah ibn Zayd had the inspiration about Adhan, well, somebody that might also be perhaps a salih person might also have an inspiration similar to that. And what's wrong with that? So here's the thing. When we look at such claims, and when we see all of that, what we may not realize is that after the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the last ayat, and one of the last ayat that were revealed, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم, and this is extremely important, that today I had perfected your religion, and ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, and the Prophet ﷺ, ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, رضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, I had accepted Islam that was revealed onto basically Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what he had taught you in terms of details, then that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala approves of. So the tricky part about using such evidence, such, let's say, general evidences, and saying, well, we've got an evidence, if it was used before, that means we could use it again, and not realize that if we are to basically stand on and stand, or at least use and depend on such evidences, then what we may not realize is anybody can claim this divine or at least holy position, or some kind of a person might actually claim that they're awliya as well. And then what you will see is that the religion is going to be in constant evolution without us realizing. You will see that groups and groups, and where, like the group al-Karkariya, they're literally dressed as clowns. Literally dressed as clowns. Wallahi, as clowns. And I don't know how these people, all of them dressed in these colorful, maybe I could show you that. All right? Maybe I could show you that. And of course, they'll basically tell you that they'll have, let's see, الفرقة الكركرية, okay, الكركرية. I want you to see that. Okay, this is it. Let's look at it. This is it. This is how everybody is dressed. This is how everybody is dressed, and they'll tell you it's basically a Sufi tariqa, and where this Sufi tariqa basically not only the Sufi tariqah, but they would depend on the whole idea that the Shaykh and Sufism in general has this idea in where the Shaykh has a direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is basically called Gnosticism. Gnosticism is when you would consider that this person has a relationship with Allah and they would get a direct inspiration, and through this direct inspiration they would basically connect and help you get connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, that's only for a prophet in Islam. And even if there were some salihin, it would not contradict what was basically رَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. It should not contradict the Quran and the Sunnah. Even if there were some salihin that had, let's say, this karamat, and they were really close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not in contradicting what was already revealed onto the Prophet ﷺ or onto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, to know whether something is approved by Allah is really coming through having the knowledge of Quran and Sunnah. That's how you would know whether this is approved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not necessarily wait for someone that would claim that they are somehow relating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they're getting a direct inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, claiming that they are telling you right there that they're basically getting some form of a religious divine inspiration to approve something that the Prophet ﷺ did not approve of, or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not approve of. And this is extremely dangerous. When, of course, people would have no ilm, they'll basically use these as evidence, and many people will get, I would say, manipulated. And we're seeing more and more groups, not only Sufi, but using the method of wanting to be mystical. I want you to focus on this one, because most of the deviant groups, they basically depended on the mystical rhetoric, depended on ways in where it's not based on knowledge, but it's based on motivational speeches. When you're going to go into motivational speeches, it can be good. But if the motivational speech and if all this talk is not based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with ilm, Quran and Sunnah, then what we're going to be seeing is such motivational speaking, and many of the followers later going to be inventing different methods. Before it was different methods for rituals, and now we're seeing different methods for thoughts. And that's extremely dangerous, even more dangerous than the other one. Because the other one leads to shirk, but this one leads to kufr. All right? Look at that. When you're talking about different methods for rituals, you're talking about shirk right there. But this one leads to kufr. And where many times we're seeing a lot of these motivational speakers adopting ideas, philosophies from postmodern ideas, or perhaps liberal, secular, feminist, and the list goes on and on. And without us realizing, of course, we're presenting it like it's an Islamic thought. Not because somebody is wearing a hijab, not because someone has a beard and is speaking in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not necessarily is that going to prove or going to reflect that that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala approves of. That's why it's important to learn Islam and to take the time to help yourself navigate through truth by learning Quran and Sunnah. And going back to these books is actually key to learning Quran and Sunnah and making sure that you're not creating your own delusion or following someone else's delusion. So just keep this one in mind, in where when he said فَأَقَرَّهَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم, So that's enough that the Prophet ﷺ had approved it. Therefore, we would know that it's the sunnah right there that was approved by the Prophet ﷺ. There are others that said, well, the Prophet ﷺ basically had approved this, but let's say he didn't approve it. Was it going to be a sunnah? What was it going to be? And so forth. And then they said, well, this would be a bid'ah hasana and not a bid'ah sayyah. It would be a good innovation. So then, of course, with this, let me say, there is a bid'ah hasana. There is a good innovation. Al-Izz ibn Abd salam explained what a good innovation is. When we say a good innovation, we're not talking about creating and inventing something in the religion because it might have a good effect. That doesn't make a good innovation. A good innovation has a basis in what he was referring to, in where it has a basis in Islam itself. What does that mean? So, for example, in Islam, teaching the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was something that was basically done by the Prophet ﷺ, by the Sahaba, and it was something the Prophet ﷺ had even encouraged and said, بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي, tell others. In other words, proselytize on my behalf what you had learned from the deen. Now, using different methods to basically ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. What could not be done but using a certain method, then that method would become obligatory to use. So what does that look like? For example, using Zoom, using Facebook, using TikTok, those different platforms in order to do da'wah. This would be wajib. This would be obligatory. The least is to say it would be the least, that it would be basically bid'ah hasana. It would be a good bid'ah. Why? Because it goes within the whole idea of the methodology and the whole idea, the concept of delivering the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. And that's the same thing when we're talking about nahu, when we're talking about the science of Arabic grammar. Arabic grammar, it didn't exist during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But did the Prophet ﷺ speak in using Arabic grammar? In other words, did he speak in taking in consideration all the grammar that we later had known about Lugha Arabiya? Well, this is فاعل, this is مفعول لأجله, this is مبني, this is مرفوع, etc. All of that? The answer is yes. In fact, the whole science of Arabic grammar was actually, yes, it came later, but it was actually to bring about the scrutiny in understanding the paradigms and understanding how language itself was set from the last times of what we know about the Prophet ﷺ. To make sure that the language, because it continues to develop from age to centuries to different political reasons and all these different things, they continue to develop. But in order to maintain the Lugha Arabiya, which was key, to maintain Lugha Arabiya from any alteration was key to making sure that we're not altering the interpretation, the words, and how we understand Quran and Sunnah. Because when you're talking about Arabic language, you're actually talking about the lens that you would read, that you would understand the whole idea, the mindset that you would read the Quran and Sunnah. If any of that is changed, And let's say it goes through the different influences, political, social, and certainly cultural, and the list goes on, in changing the languages exactly the same way how languages, and we know in linguistics, all the different influences that influence a language to continue changing from time to time and all of that, then what will end up in the Quran being not understood, the Sunnah not being understood. And later on, we'll invent our ways to reinterpret and interpret the Quran and Sunnah. So that's why when we look at Lugha Arabiya, it was key to understanding, making the study of Nahu actually a bid'ah hasana. A bid'ah hasana, it wasn't during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but it was practiced by the Prophet ﷺ. It was applied, the rules were applied in the Quran. The rules were applied in the words of the Prophet ﷺ, in the words, and the Sahaba. They all spoke with proper Arabic. And later, the Nahu, or at least the Arabic grammar, was later researched, or let's say put in, laid out in order to maintain the paradigm that they had spoken in in that language. And that's why bid'ah hasana would be for nahu. Same thing when you're talking about tajweed. The Prophet ﷺ didn't know what a mad lazim, kalimi muthaqqal was. He didn't have those names, didn't have a name in where this is idgham, this is ikhfa, this is qalqala, this is. But did he read the Quran with such rules? Yes, he did. Did Jibreel read the Quran with such rules? Yes, he did. Did he read it with mad? Yes, with lengthening. Yes, he did. And the tajweed later was basically set as, let's say, a method to help identify all the different paradigms, all the different categories in where, how do we understand the method in where they blended this letter with that letter, or perhaps they lengthened this letter just to help us understand, because the Quran itself was preserved in the words themselves. The Quran was preserved even by the sound of it. Even the sound of the Quran, yes, even the sound, the harmony of the Quran was preserved in order to make sure that the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't go through any alterations whatsoever, not by the words, not by the written words, and certainly not by the sound of it. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. For the Lord Almighty had revealed the dhikr, and therefore the Lord Almighty was going to preserve it. Now, teaching tajweed is a bid'ah hasana. So that's what we would mean by bid'ah hasana. But unfortunately, many, because of the lack of ilm, they would use certain words that might seem, let's say, attractive, and they will put it in the wrong, on the wrong items. So they will take out the word of bid'ah hasana and say, well, Al-Izz ibn Abd salam spoke of bid'ah hasana, so this is a bid'ah hasana. Well, the word bid'ah means innovation. Hasana means good. And we just talked about what he meant by bid'ah hasana. The general wording, the general description for any innovation, that the Prophet ﷺ said that every bid'ah is dalala, every innovation is a delusion, it's a manipulation. كل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. And every delusion is going to be in hellfire. Now, this is extremely important to keep within that context, where we understand that if a person feels that, yes, I'm going to invent this, but it is for a good cause, without us realizing, many times they'll be going into, in fact, all the times, if it's a dalala, it's going to be taking them into finnar, into hellfire. So how do we make sure that we are safe and we're not inventing or innovating different methods, that's why we have to go back to Quran and Sunnah. We have to use that lens to help us make sure that we're applying Islam as approved by the Prophet ﷺ and not necessarily as approved by our own intuitions, or then we would, without us realizing, fall in this whole delusion, thinking that it's basically for a good cause, thinking that it's bringing in some form of support, and then without us realizing, we're taking people out from il-hidayah to dalala. All right, so then we went into some details and we said scholars had differences of opinions in regards to adhan and iqama. So what's the difference between al-adhan? Al-adhan would be to call on to the prayer in general, basically to announce the entrance or the start of a prayer time. Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, that's basically to announce the start. Al-iqama is to announce the actual congregation that is being held at the masjid or being held at home or in a particular place. That's al-iqama. Okay, so of course you had differences of opinions. We went in details in regards to that, whether adhan should only be done in masajid or whether it could also be done whether a person is traveling, or whether adhan is even obligatory, or whether it is, we said, fard kifaya. And we said fard kifaya is communal obligation. We went in details about that. And we left off at this hadith in where Malik ibn al-Huwayrith, when he had said بينما نحن عند رسول الله شبابة متقاربون. We went in details with that hadith when Malik ibn al-Huwayrith, when the Prophet ﷺ actually tells him that فَأَقِيمُوا فِيهِمْ وَعَلِّمُوهُمْ وَمُرُوهُمْ. So stay amongst them, علموهم, teach them and order them to apply the religion, to apply, of course, the different principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when salat time comes, of course, do the adhan and وَلْيَؤُمَّكُمْ أَكْبَرُكُمْ. So we went in details right there in regards to that. So we're not going to go over it again. I'm not going to actually go over everything about al-adhan. There's really a lot to say, but I'm going to skip a lot of it, not necessarily because it's not important, but I would say because if we would continue with all the things that relate to adhan, I would say we might actually get many of you just feeling that, okay, this is becoming too overwhelming in regards to just adhan. So we'll, inshallah, go over the key points, inshallah. All right, so right there in where Abu Umar, who's Abu Umar? Abu Umar is basically Ibn Abd al-Barr. He said, Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, and Ashabahuma. What is Ashabahuma? Ashab al-Shafi'i, meaning the Shafi'i scholars, and the Hanafi scholars, and the Thawri and Ahmad, and they all said that if a person is a traveler and they left al-adhan, whether deliberately forgetting or deliberately leaving and not doing the adhan, or whether they had forgotten, that their salah is basically أجزأته صلاته وكذلك لو ترك الإقامة عندهم. So they considered that if a person did not do adhan, and whether it was on purpose or whether because they had forgotten that it was something that is recommended to do, then their salah is still valid. So we're talking about musafir right there. And what is the evidence that they had used? Well, they said anyways, al-adhan is not obligatory. All right, therefore in where if a person leaves and does not do adhan, then therefore it would not necessarily make salah invalid. It doesn't make it invalid. All right, just keep that one in mind really quick. I'm just right there in where Malik, al-Shafi'i, and even ashabuhuma, or did I say ashabahuma here? Okay, ashabuhuma, in where what they said was Malik and Shafi'i. Ashabuhuma means Ashab Malik and Ashab Shafi'i. When we're talking about Ashab, remember we're not talking about friends here, we're talking about the students. We're talking about those that adhered to those madhahib. They basically said al-adhan is mathna, mathna. What is mathna, mathna? In where Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about that it's done in duality. In other words, it's done in where every dhikr is basically done twice. Versus al-iqama is done once. So hayya ala salah, hayya ala al-falah. All right, so this is 1, 1, 1, and we're not repeating that. All right, versus Shafi'i, yurabbi'u takbir al-awwal. So what is yurabbi'u? Yurabbi'u actually means he makes it in 4. So Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And of course we would say we're talking about making it into 4. And there's one very important figure that I wanted to actually talk about, which is Abu Mahdhura. What is the story of Abu Mahdhura? Where I actually wanted to mention the story of Mahdhura. I can't believe I lost it, but we'll talk about Abu Mahdhura in just a bit. So Abu Mahdhura basically was taught by the Prophet ﷺ how to do the Adhan. Well, that's the same thing where we've got hadith Abdullah ibn Zayd that basically had exactly what dream they had in regards to Adhan. And that piece in where, of course, as-salatu khayrun min al-nawm, in where the Prophet ﷺ approved it. And certainly when you see that there's a narration that Abu Mahdhura said, well, here's how the Prophet ﷺ taught me the Adhan, and the Prophet ﷺ approves Zayd, Abdullah ibn Zayd. How do we connect these two? So here, of course, just to let you know, in where the Prophet ﷺ had basically said that Adhan Ahl Mecca, it was basically done as Abu Mahdhura, since he was the assigned mu'adhin for the people of Mecca. He was assigned by the Prophet ﷺ, and later on, of course, this Adhan, they would continue. That's why until the time of today, the Adhan of Mecca sounds different than the Adhan that you would have in Medina. They would go all the way back to Abu Mahdhura's time. So Abu Mahdhura was taught by the Prophet ﷺ on how to make the Adhan. Until the time of today, Adhan Mecca sounds basically trying to replicate Abu Mahdhura. Okay? And of course, when we're speaking about الترجيع في الأذان, what is that? All right, it's basically when al-mu'adhin would say أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله twice, أشهد أن محمد رسول الله, and then basically do it in this way, in where أشهد أن لا إله, and of course they would lengthen that, in where that is a tarjih, in where they would basically string أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله, and would basically strengthen it in that way. So that's basically called a tarjih, and where we're strengthening, we're lengthening right there, in where this lengthening is basically called الترجيع, in where they consider that is that's basically to be done in this part, in this piece of it. So it's not to be done in, let's say, in other parts of the Adhan, but it would be done in Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Okay, we're just right there making it, trying to do it really quick, in where, let's say, Abu Hanifa, al-adhan wal-iqama jami'an mathna ma'athna, considered that no, al-adhan and al-iqama would be 2 times each, let's call it a set of 2 for each one. Okay, we're just gonna, I'm going to, like I said, you could say I'm just skipping really quick right there, in order to get to, I guess, the story that I actually wanted to get to. Let's get to this one. اختلفوا في التثويب لصلاة الصبح. What is it, tathweeb? Tathweeb is basically when a mu'addan says as-salatu khayrun min al-nawm. So that's called at-tathweeb. Let's look at that word. At-tathweeb is basically when the mu'addan says as-salatu khayrun min al-nawm. And they had differences of opinions. And of course, certainly, when a mu'adhan would say hayya ala salah, hayya ala al-falah, or as-salatu khayrun min al-nawm 2 times, in where does he say it 2 times? And of course, when he was in Egypt, that is a Shafi'i, he didn't used to say that as-salatu khayrun min nawm is part of the adhan. I want you to look at this one. But when Shafi'i was in Iraq, he said that it was part of the adhan. How did he change? Well, he basically came across other evidences that he basically considered that, well, I was wrong in understanding those resources. Now I have a different resource, and basically changed his madhab. I want you to look at this one. His own madhab, he changed it 2 times. And you want to keep in mind, the Shafi'i only lived 45 years old. All right, let's continue right there. Just keep in mind in where, if we're speaking about adhan, of course, Hadith Abu Mahdhura, in where that's key right there. Hadith Abu Mahdhura. And Abu Mahdhura was young when the Prophet ﷺ had actually met him. And he was really just this young man that was, I guess, trying to engage in some kind of entertainment with his friends, when the Prophet ﷺ basically invites him alone and starts talking to him about Salah and about Islam. Right there, we'll talk about that story, inshallah. Let me actually go to it. Unfortunately, I don't know where all my highlights, where they had went, but that's all right. I'm just trying to go over it really quick. Adhan Abu Mahdhura fi Salat al-Subh mashhurun عند العلماء. Let's just go right there. The adhan of Abu Mahdhura in regards to Salat al-Fajr. Oh, basically talked about it before. Okay, let's see. Let's look at this one. And we're number right there. In where Ta'dhin Bilal versus the Adhan Bilal, which basically is the Adhan that was seen in the dream. It was narrated by Imam Ahmad, and about all of it goes back to Abdullah ibn Zayd. And it was Bilal Mawla Abi Bakr. Bilal ibn Rabah, basically the one that we would know, the famous Habashi. He was the one that was given, of course, the privilege to do the Adhan. And the Prophet ﷺ basically was the one that designated him for that. And he was called by the Prophet ﷺ in where on Fajr morning. And the Prophet ﷺ, of course, when he went to the Prophet ﷺ, and فصرخ بلال بأعلى صوته الصلاة خير من النوم. So Bilal basically said الصلاة خير من النوم, yelled in a loud voice, the loudest voice. And Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib had said this word was then basically I guess added and annexed to the adhan for Salat al-Fajr. Okay, so basically that piece of it. Okay, let's see right there. I'm gonna try to skip this one. أجمع أهل العلم, all scholars had agreed that it is part of the sunnah that we would not do the adhan until the timing had already entered. In other words, you don't do the adhan before the actual timing for that salah. Why not? Well, then you're confusing people. Except Salat al-Fajr. Except Salat al-Fajr. Why? Because for Salat al-Fajr, they would actually do adhan before the actual time for Fajr happens, according to the Madhab Maliki, Shafi'i, and Ahmad. And they basically depended on this hadith. That Bilal يؤذن بليل فكلوا واشربوا حتى ينادي ابن أم مكتوم. This is the evidence. They said Bilal would make the adhan during the night. That is, not during the time designated for Fajr. So, fakulu, so continue eating and drinking. In other words, if you wanted to do your siyam, حتى ينادي ibn Maktoum, until Ibn Maktoum would do his adhan. Well, that's to announce that Fajr had already started. So that's why you would see that Malik, Shafi'i, Ahmad, Ishaq, Abu Thawr, etc., they had basically said that Adhan Salat al-Fajr is before the actual timing. But Abu Hanifa, he said no, you would only do the Adhan for Salat al-Subh only when the time actually happens. What's the evidence? They said, well, we've got a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, remember the hadith about Malik ibn Huwayrith, بينما نحن شبابة متقاربون, and what were they doing? Well, they were with the Prophet ﷺ. That hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ tells him, إذا حضرت الصلاة فأذنا ثم أقيما وليؤمكما أكبركما. In where the Prophet ﷺ said, if the timing for Salah comes, then do the Adhan and start the Iqamah and let the eldest of you lead the prayer. So they said, well, that's basically the same thing. In where just for Salat al-Fajr, that we would really go back to the evidence right there, in where it's only to happen, you would do the Adhan when the timing is basically officially enters the right time. And I usually get this question. Many times people are wondering, hey, does that mean we're supposed to be delaying it? What should we do? Just wanted to, I guess, explain this piece in where differences of opinions between scholars on whether the Adhan only for Salat al-Fajr, not for the other salawat, on whether it should happen before the designated time or whether after the designated time. And you could see those are two different ahadith, and each one basically based their evidence, based on their opinion on hadith, basically evidence. So just see this one. And just okay, let's see the other one. In where, if we're talking, so what is the preponderant right there? What should we do? Well, if the area that you're living in is applying this hadith, well, make sure you are aware of it. And then if you want to pray Fajr, just recognize that not the second that you would hear the Adhan, that doesn't necessarily mean it's Fajr time. Okay? Just keep that in mind. But if you're in an area that applies this madhab, then you would know, just by hearing the Adhan for Salat al-Fajr at least, for Salat al-Fajr, then you would know that no, it's enough. Salat al-Fajr, they would only do it at a certain time. So that's why, of course, you would have the Hanafi madhab area would have their Adhan at a different timing from the Adhan for Salat Salat al-Fajr, for, of course, the other madhab. All right, so if you were to look at your apps, the app would give you an option to choose the Hanafi madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, or whether it's Isna, or whether it's the Azhar, or whether it's the different Shia, or whether it's Sunnah, etc. You see it? So even for Salat al-Fajr, you would say, well, wait a minute, the timing is supposed to be the timing. So now you know that for the majority, they regarded that no, the Adhan for Salat al-Fajr is actually before Salat al-Fajr. And for the Hanafi, no, Adhan Salat al-Fajr is actually when Fajr happens, not after, not before. It's when Fajr happens, that's when you would do the Adhan. All right, and of course, we saw how they depended both on those hadith. All right. Is the person that does the Adhan the same person that does the Iqamah as well? Well, they had differences of opinions on whether it's supposed to be the same one or it can be someone else. Let's see, Malik and Abu Hanifa, they said there's nothing wrong, in other words, with one doing the Adhan and someone else doing the Iqamah. And they basically depended on Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Zayd. You could say it's basically his son. Basically, Abdullah ibn Zayd is that Sahabi that had the dream of the Adhan, and Muhammad is basically his his son. Okay, عن أبي meaning he basically narrated off his father, who basically had the dream that the Prophet ﷺ ordered him أمره إذا رأى النداء في النوم أن يلقيه على بلال. That when basically he would see a nida whenever, he saw the nida, he saw the adhan in his sleep, and he basically taught it to Bilal. So Bilal basically did the adhan, and Abdullah ibn Zayd was the one to do the iqamah. Abdullah ibn Zayd was to do the iqamah. You know, one thing I would like to say, you could see that the Prophet ﷺ, ordering this one to do the adhan, and that one to do the iqamah, and that one to pick up the shoes, and the other one was to basically learn a language, and the other one was to engage in military activity, and the other one was, no, you don't belong in military, just give me poetry. I want you to be the person to do the poetry. And the other one, I just want you to be there for the wounded. So, and that's one thing in where you could see that not everyone mastered all areas. We would think that a leader is a person that masters everything, but that's not actually the case. A leader's job is to distribute people's potentials and where they belong. You're good at marketing, you do the marketing. You're good at accounting, you do the accounting. You're good at, giving ilm, you give ilm. You're good at speaking to the younger generation, speak to the younger generation. And we're not supposed to be contradicting each other's roles, because we complete one another. And you want to keep in mind in where we cannot consider that it's all the work of one person. And even if we're speaking about, let's say, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, or we're speaking about different ulama and different successes and victories in history, we would usually name just one person, but that person recognizes that if it wasn't by the help of this person and that person, I would not have been capable of doing it. Let me give you an example in where Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. Of course, we would just know Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi freed al-Masjid al-Aqsa, or at least the Levant, Bilad al-Sham, from the Crusaders' grip. But the truth of the matter, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi would not have been capable of doing it on his own. Imad al-Din al-Zinki, Imad al-Din and Nur al-Din Zinki, Imad al-Din, he was the one that founded the whole idea to actually start there, and he started in al-Mosul in al-Iraq. Nur al-Din Zinki continued this legacy and united Bilad al-Sham, or at least part of Bilad al-Sham. And then later on, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi was really a soldier getting training from his uncle Shirkuh, and part of it, this is not at all to say it wasn't a good effort, or that we should not basically give it to Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. No, it's just understanding that the victories don't happen from one person, that even if it's a person that's probably working as a person that was writing or scribing the information, or perhaps a qadi, or perhaps helping with things that people may not usually recognize, even if it's plumbing. Whatever it is, people usually don't recognize these people until something goes wrong. So just keep that in mind, in where Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, of course, then he gets the trust from the king al-Adad, who was a king a Shia king, and this king was already extremely sick, even though not old, but he was already extremely sick, but had given Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. I guess there was a relationship, a friendship between Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and the king al-Adid, and that paved the way to, of course, make Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi really later be the official king. And then later on, of course, Nuruddin Zinki, okay, are you right now a rival here? And what do we understand with this? And later on, of course, it wasn't an easy thing where, okay, now you created a whole kingdom in Egypt, and we already have Nuruddin Zinki, who was supposed to be the deputy on behalf of Nuruddin Zinki in Egypt, and now you're officially a king. Well, that actually moves you from being a deputy for Nuruddin Zinki to being a rival in owning what now? Owning Egypt, which basically would mean that it's a rival against who? Well, against Bilad al-Sham. But of course, it was his taqwa. That's the key. It was taqwa. He could have actually announced it as, hey, Nuruddin Zinki, you either submit to my power and allow me to expand Bilad al-Sham and include it to the kingdom of Egypt. He could have done that and basically waged a war and created a whole division. But instead, he sends to Nuruddin Zinki that no, you are the one that we're going to be following. You are the one that's leading all of this. And I want you to just keep that in mind, in where when we may have our own ego go into the surface, and we might feel that, no, I want to be in control, I want to determine, I want to decide, etc. That would be the shaitan's way to break, divide any form of brotherhood and sisterhood, any form of working towards one mission. In order to be successful as a leader, you have to accept and understand that there has to be the contribution from others, and you have to know that what's leading all of this is not necessarily you, but it's also their contribution. Even the Prophet ﷺ, although the hadith is not authentic, but it was definitely demonstrating something that was really happening during the Prophet ﷺ, in where he said, "Nusirtu bil-shabab," I was given victory by the young men, the youth. They were the ones that made this happen. Nusirtu bil-shabab. Even though, you could see that the Prophet ﷺ was definitely mu'ayyad min indillah. He was supported by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if the shabab weren't there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to give him victory despite. That's it. Bi-amrillah, by the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's important to see how the Prophet ﷺ was giving, even when we're seeing Muslims that were only 3 and 4 month Muslims, like Amr ibn al-As, where he ordered him to lead that as-salasil, a whole battle. How can you trust somebody? I mean, he's only been Muslim for 3-4 months now? But yes, the Prophet ﷺ still had given him this position. Amr ibn al-As, you're a person that has a history of being intelligent, being a person of war, being a person that just knows how to do these different tactics. You lead all of this. He's only 4 months Muslim. Yes, since right now he moved. And you want to keep in mind, when you look at the different ways how the Prophet ﷺ appointed different Sahaba to do different matters, each one was basically, let's say, displaying certain potentials. We're going to see down the road, right there, in where, Bilal ibn Rabah, he was basically having a beautiful voice, but then the Prophet ﷺ basically appointed him to doing al-Adhan. And of course, that was something that was an honor. You know, one thing I would like to say. Every time I go to Masjid al-Aqsa, I want you to remember this one. Inshallah, you'll get the chance to go to Masjid al-Aqsa. After the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Bilal ibn Rabah continued to do the Adhan during the time of Bakr as-Siddiq. But then Bilal couldn't continue during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab. So he moved to Bilad al-Sham. He couldn't do the Adhan. He never did it later. And it isn't until Bilal ibn Rabah and Umar ibn al-Khattab, they went to basically the area of Palestine, Masjid al-Aqsa, and then of course met the king who surrendered to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he had a condition that Umar ibn al-Khattab himself would come in order for them to surrender to him, to make sure that the Christians there were going to be living under Umar ibn al-Khattab's rule to ensure their justice. And of course, to announce the victory of the Muslims, Umar ibn al-Khattab orders Bilal ibn Rabah to do the Adhan. And that was the last time that Bilal ibn Rabah had ever done the Adhan. It was when al-Masjid al-Aqsa was basically under Muslim rule during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab. All right, let's see right there, and where حكم المؤذن أن يترسل في أذانه ولا يطرب. I want you to look at this one, and where, what does it mean? In where to the person making the Adhan, in where they would make the Adhan, and of course you're doing the Adhan, but not ولا يطرب. What is ولا يطرب? يطرب actually means to make a harmony. And he said, it is common that people today, the ignorant people, that's what he called them. He said, juhal, ignorant people, and basically many of al-tagham is like the laymen, the ignorant ones, in where they would start using and doing all these different harmonies to make the Adhan, and they would يرجعون فيه الترجيعات. What is يرجعون فيه الترجيعات? Meaning that they would make all these harmonies and all these different sounds, and if they're singing a song, and they would start breaking it up in certain ways to the point that you don't even understand what he's saying. He said the Prophet ﷺ had basically told, let's see, it was narrated that Ibn Abbas, he basically said that the Prophet ﷺ had a mu'adhin who used to use these kinds of yutarrib. He was basically singing it in a way, or making it like giving it a harmony. But the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna al-adhana sahlun samh. Al-adhan is something easy. You don't have to invent, you don't have to add all of this. فَإِن كَانَ أَذَانُكَ سَمْحًا سَهْلًا وَإِلَّا فَلَا تُؤَذِّنْ. If you're going to be making the Adhan in where it's going to be smooth, easy, without all these different additions, then go ahead and do the Adhan. But if you're not going to, then don't do the Adhan. I want you to keep that one in mind, because many times right now, of course, we're seeing people put in so many different things in the Adhan. People right now are putting in, of course, these sound effects, and they're becoming easy to basically get using social media and all of that. And if you're putting all those sound effects, then you're changing You're changing the actual words. You're changing the actual presentation of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted adhan or qira'at al-Quran to be. Same thing when we're talking about the different, what is called al-maqamat. Let me just talk about that for a bit. What is al-maqamat? So al-maqam, you've got different maqamat, 14 different maqamat. What does that mean? So al-maqam, you've got different harmonies that were famous at the time. So you got maqam Nahawand, you got maqam Sika, you got maqam Iraq, you got maqam, all these, Saba, etc. And these maqamat, they were really harmonies for music. But it isn't until later you saw that people were using these maqamat in order to recite the Quran. Now, these maqamat, to practice the harmony, you basically have to let that harmony basically determine when you strengthen, when you shorten, when you basically, put in some power, when it's a sad tune, it's a happy tune, it's a tune of power, and the list goes on and on. There's definitely an exaggeration in teaching al-maqamat, and you would see a lot of times people thinking that in order to be a Quran reciter that you really have to know these maqamat. Il-maqamat have nothing to do with reciting the Quran, have nothing to do with tajweed, have nothing to do with ilm al-Islam, not in any way. Ilm al-maqamat, that the maqamat and all of that area, that is basically an area of music and has nothing to do with religion. Now, can I apply al-maqamat on Quranic recitation? Differences of opinions between scholars. But even the scholars that said it was permissible to use al-maqamat, for example, I'm using maqam Nahawand, for example, to read a particular ayah that sounds, anyways, maqam Nahawand is a sad maqam, and I'm using that in order to explain how sad the people are going to be in, let's say, hellfire, okay, in order to tahriq al-qulub. Now, the scholars that said it was permissible to use al-maqamat, they said on a condition that it would still apply, and you would still apply the rules of tajweed. So if you're using the maqam to read the Quran, but you're not applying the rule of tajweed, but you're applying the maqam, then that would be a form of editing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It would therefore be haram. That's it. It would be a bid'ah. A bid'ah, and what type of bid'ah? Not a bid'ah hasana. No. It would be the bid'ah where not done by the Prophet. It would be that innovation. It would be haram. Now, the scholars that said it was permissible, they said, well, the Prophet orders Abu Musa al-Ash'ari Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was reading the Quran beautifully, and the Prophet ﷺ was listening to him, and then he tells him that you were given mizmar min mazamiri Ali Dawood. You were given mizmar. Mizmar is like a tune, and not necessarily a flute, and not necessarily some kind of a musical instrument. So it's the tune of Ali Dawood. Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, whenever he would read the scripture, he would read it, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically described that the birds, the mountains would sing the tune along with Prophet Dawood alayhi salam. What was it? It was the echo. The birds were making the sounds in the background. Of course, chirping sounds. And the birds were, who knows, were they making their dhikr? What were they chirping into? What was sound? What were they doing? But then, and يا جبال أوبي معه والطير. Jibal, the mountains. He would read, and the echo would start basically echoing in the mountains, between the mountains, as he was reading basically the scripture. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised that. And certainly it was a beautiful sound that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would describe the harmony of it, in where it was like the sounds that, as if the birds and the mountains were all basically singing along the scripture with Prophet Dawood. I want you to look at this word, in where when Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he tells Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, you had the tune of one of the tunes of Dawood. This is Prophet Dawood, David alayhi salam. And then Abu Musa al-Ash'ari said, if I had known about you, لَحَبَّرْتُهُ لَكَ تَحْبِيرًا. What does that mean? I would have even beautified it even more if I would have known that you were listening to me. Now, does that mean that we could use al-maqam to actually read the Quran? Now, those that, again, they said, hey, here it is. The Prophet ﷺ didn't tell him that he wasn't supposed to be reading with a maqam, or at least the question is, was he even reading with a maqam? So to claim that there was a maqam at all really needs evidence. He just said, لَحَبَّرْتُهُ لَكَ تَحْبِيرًا. I would have beautified the voice. لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَتَغَنَّى بِالْقُرْآنِ. You would not be part of the Muslimin unless you would beautify your voice with it. But beautifying the voice is one thing, and doing it with a maqam is another thing. So the ones that said that, no, you can read with maqam, they said, well, anyways, whether you read it in a simple recitation, you're going to be reading with a maqam anyways. Even if you just read it in إِذَا وَقَعَتِ الْوَاقِعَةِ لَيْسَ لِوَقَعَتِهَا كَاذِبَةٌ. Even if you just read it in that way, well, you're going to be within one of these maqamat, whether it's a sabah or whether it's sika or what, you're going to be hitting one of those maqamat. But then the scholars that completely warned about maqamat, they said that is a really dangerous thing, because the second that we would open the doors for people to start learning maqamat and not learn the Quran itself and the words themselves to be the place of inspiration, then we're basically then channeling the Muslims into focusing on the sound and not the words, and not the inspiration, and not the revelation. So you would see, for example, a lot of the qurra, the reciters in Egypt, for example, they would be reciting about hellfire. And then in the background, people are Allah, 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 alayk ya sheikh. And it's like, wait a minute, did you recognize what he just said? But they're taking it as if it was Kulthum, as if it was some singer, as if it was some song, and not necessarily what the Quran is actually saying. So in that situation, am I necessarily against al-maqamat, or am I pro al-maqamat? I'm basically saying that reading the Quran is supposed to be read the way that the Prophet ﷺ had read it. We cannot use al-maqamat in order to read the Quran based on a certain maqam at the expense of tajweed. That's what I'm saying. Some of the best reciters that recited the Quran, I would say al-Minshawi. Al-Minshawi is perhaps one of the best reciters, in where even when he had read, let's say, Maqam Nahawand, which is really my favorite maqam, he would read the Quran in the maqam, but not at the expense of tajweed. Not at the expense of tajweed whatsoever. Not at the expense of losing the actual way where the Prophet ﷺ had recited the Quran. Then in that situation, it would be permissible. But if we are exaggerating in wanting to just focus on the maqam at the expense of tajweed, then that would make it haram. Okay, let's continue. So when a person is making al-adhan, what else should they be doing? يستقبل القبلة. Basically, they would face the qibla according to majority of the scholars, and then they would start, I guess, going left and right with their head whenever they would say hayya ala salah. So why going left and right? So they're basically turning right, turning left, and while they're saying hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, according to the majority or many scholars. Okay, why did they say that? Well, they said when you're doing the adhan is all about informing others that the timing of salah had already begun. Had already began or begun? Okay, well, it already started. Now, when you're changing the position for your head, you're just letting the people, I guess, on the east side of you and the west side of you basically hear this. Let's see, Imam Ahmad, he basically said no. There's no turning in any way because إِلَّا أَن يَكُونَ فِي مَنَارَةٍ, unless they were on a minaret, and then of course this person is standing on a high part on that minaret, and then in that situation basically wanted to turn because his voice, of course, is the only amplifier. So in that situation, in where to turn left and right is basically to make sure to bring the announcement for everyone to basically say it. Let's see. And he said, and it is liked that the person that's listening to the adhan, in where to repeat and mimic what is basically said in the adhan, and if they were to complete it, then of course, let's say, what is the adhan? Well, basically the words of the adhan. Let's see, in Sahih Muslim, Umar ibn al-Khattab, that the Prophet ﷺ said, إذا قال المؤذن الله أكبر الله أكبر فقال أحدكم الله أكبر ثم قال أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله قال أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ثم قال أشهد أن محمد رسول الله قال أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. So what does that mean? So if the mu'adhin says Allahu Akbar, and one of the person that is listening would basically say Allahu Akbar, say it 2 times, well then repeat it, mimic them. And if they were to say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, then say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So the person that's making the adhan is saying Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. The person that's hearing the adhan is repeating after them. And then they would repeat after them. When they would say Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, they would repeat after them Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And then when the mu'adhin says Hayya ala salah, the person, Hayya ala salah means come to prayer. The person that is listening is saying La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. What is La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, in where there is no power beyond the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does that, why is that supposed to be a response to Hayya ala salah? In order for us to recognize that when the mu'addin is calling for prayer, it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in need for your prayer, and that's why we're basically confirming right there, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no power beyond the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no sovereignty, there is no might, there is no power beyond the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, what gives you the power is really when you go to salah. It's the power is to be given to you, but why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala owns the power. So when you're going to salah, when we're calling you to salah, don't misunderstand it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling you because He's in need of you, but that's basically a call for you to recognize that you are in need for this, let's call it inspiration / in where you're in need for this power that you would find in salah. ثم قال, and of course, if the mu'addin is saying حي على الفلاح, you would also say لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. There's no power. Whenever the mu'addin would say come to success, you would basically repeat the same thing. There's no there's no power beyond the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they would say Allahu Akbar, and of course the person repeating and mimicking the mu'adhin till the end. And of course, if they were to do that, لا إله إلا الله من قلبه دخل الجنة. If they were to do that from the bottom of their heart, from their heart, then they would enter the Jannah. Okay, let's see. Here's another hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ said, من قال حين يسمع المؤذن أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله رضيت بالله ربا وبمحمد رسولا وبالإسلام دينا غفر له ما تقدم من ذنبه. Let's see, look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever hears the mu'adhin saying, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, I bear witness that there is no God worthy of worship. He is one with no partners to be associating with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that Muhammad is the servant and the prophet of Allah Almighty. I am content of the Lord Almighty. In other words, I believe in the Lord Almighty as my Lord, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as the Prophet of Allah, and of Islam as the religion, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would forgive them all the sins that they would do perhaps in the future. All right, so this basically, right there you could see this hadith is narrated in Sahih Muslim and is also narrated in Musnad Ahmad. So inshallah, of course, we'll talk about some of, when you're talking about fadl al-adhan wal-mu'adhin, is there any, let's say, is there any high rank? Is there any promotion? Let's say it that way in the business world. Is there any preference? Why is doing the adhan or being a mu'adhin, is there anything that relates to it? Of course, there are many ahadith. Let's say this one, in where this hadith, narrated by Muslim, of course, on Abi Hurairah, that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا نُودِيَ لِلصَّلَاةِ أَدْبَرَ الشَّيْطَانُ لَهُ ضُرَاطٌ حَتَّى لَا يَسْمَعُ التَّأْذِينَ. If the call to prayer, a shaitan would run and turn away with a passing wind sound, so of course in order to basically interrupt, and so it can make like a noise pollution in order for him not to hear the adhan. And certainly al-adhan itself is a shi'arul Islam. It's basically right there. It's the adhan, it's the call, and it is definitely the motto of Islam. It's basically to keep us connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And on Judgment Day, those that would do the adhan, it was narrated in Sahih Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-mu'adhinuna atwalu nasi a'naqan yawm al-qiyamah. That the ones to do the adhan on Judgment Day, they would have the longest necks, although it doesn't sound, and it doesn't make it attractive to actually say that they had the longest neck. Is it necessarily in where literally a long neck, in where, of course, or is that an indication that they would be safe from the different, of course, stations during Yawm al-Qiyamah, and they would be safe from all of that? And of course, al-Arab would use atwalun nas as a metaphor to basically mean that they would be in the highest strength, that they would be the most honorable people. And just keep that one in mind. Is that a metaphor, or is that really literally that they would have these long necks, kind of like a giraffe? Or is it a metaphor to actually mean that they would be in the highest strength, where they would stand out, being honorable? At the end of the day, of course, whether صوت المؤذن, whether it's a jinn hearing it, a human hearing it, or anything hearing it on Judgment Day, they would all witness, they would come forward witnessing that this person was basically right there calling for the testimony of faith. Let's see, let's look at this hadith. Love this hadith. من أذن محتسبا 7 سنين كتبت له براءة من النار. Let's look at this hadith. Is it? Let's see. In where in Nawawi had considered it as da'if, and there's this narrator, Jabir ibn Yazid al-Ju'fi, and they said that he was not authentic. At-Tirmidhi said hadithun gharib, so that would actually tell us that this hadith, you're not going to find it in other with other chains of narration. So it was mentioned by Ibn Majah. Ironically, he didn't actually say what. Okay, let's see right there in where this hadith, man adhana muhtasiban. So you could see yes, although it's not authentic, but let's read it anyways. Whoever would do the adhan muhtasiban, muhtasiban, in other words, they're not getting paid for it for 7 years, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would decree that this person would be free from hellfire. Free from hellfire, in other words, they would not be entering it. Okay, so this is it. Inshallah, we will continue. Let's see this one. Is this the story? Yeah, this is the story. Finally, I came across it. It's 146. So here's what we'll do. We'll continue tomorrow, and tomorrow we're actually going to be, let me just draw a line right there so that we would know this is where we left off at. We're going to be talking about Abu Mahdhura, who was this young man that was, I guess, just combining and gathering these young men so they would sing together. What was his story? How did he transition from a person that was obsessed with, of course, I guess, guys being around him and singing and having fun and entertainment, to a man that was doing al-Adhan? What really happened? So stay tuned for tomorrow. Inshallah, we'll talk about some details in regards to Adhan tomorrow. So this is our first day in using, of course, this platform. I would like to see your feedback and what you thought about this platform. Was it easy to get into?